Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The History Blokes, the podcast where we discuss curious facts, fantastic stories, and interesting and strange people from Australia's past. I'm Chris McComb.
I'm Conan Elphick.
And we're here speaking to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. Oh, and you can find us, of course, on Instagram at History Blokes and wherever you get your podcast from.
Yes, remember to rate us. I'd say 2 out of 5 stars.
I'd go 2 out of 5. So, Conan, we're up to episode 10. Can't believe we've reached this milestone.
It is a milestone, Chris. Yeah, and it's been about 5 months without any creative differences to speak of. I sort of consider us to be the John Lennon and Paul McCartney of Australian history podcasting. So it's amazing we haven't split up really, given the sheer raw talent.
We've kept going. I picture myself more as a Ringo, I think, but I'm willing to take the Paul McCartney or the John Lennon, I suppose. But yes, I can't believe we're here. 5 months. It's been an absolute pleasure, Conan, and I know we've got a fantastic story to talk about.
I thought I'd save this one up for the 10th episode because you know that it's my favourite topic in Australian history. It's the wreck of the Batavia. I'm excited because it is such a bizarre incident in its own right. It's pretty much the first time Europeans had any kind of meaningful contact with the Australian continent. It's sort of almost a proto-settlement, really, in a way. And it's also a Nazism in microcosm. And I think, Chris, given the topic, this might be a bumper edition. It might go for longer than usual. So a heads up for everyone again, as I mentioned in the last episode, there's quite a bit of human suffering revealed in this episode. So if that upsets you, maybe stop listening after the quiz. Chris, that doesn't distress you. You're a fan of human suffering, aren't you?
Maybe not. But seafaring, I do like seafaring.
You like seafaring?
Yes, indeed.
Right? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not saying you inflict human suffering.
I appreciate that.
Those days are behind you.
They are. They certainly are, for sure.
So let me set the scene before we go into the quiz. 1629. Imagine, Chris, that you are a young merchant. You're an employee of the Dutch East Indies Company. You're aboard the Batavia. You've been 6 months at sea. You're not enjoying it. Perhaps you've discovered you're seasick and every day has been torture. I know you're not, because as you like to remind us, you've sailed on a Dutch ship.
I have indeed. Yes. the replica Dolphin, of course. I think we may have mentioned that in the previous episode.
I think you did at length.
That is not the intermission, people, I promise you.
No. So you're a young merchant, you're in a tiny cabin, not much room, it's been an ordeal, and you're one of the lucky ones, at least you have a cabin. You're on the Batavia, there are 330 souls aboard, and you're trying to get to sleep, but you can't. It's the small hours of the morning, and the reason you can't get to sleep is because you're worried. You're worried because you're currently sailing due east in the roaring 40s, between the latitudes 40 and 50 degrees south, taking advantage of the trade winds, but you know that at some point, just before the Batavia gets to Australia, it's got to turn left.
Where is it on its way to?
That's a very good point. It just occurred to me that I hadn't mentioned that. It's on its way to its namesake, to Batavia, which is now Jakarta. So the Batavia has to turn left and then head due north. But the problem is the Batavia doesn't know its
longitude,
which you'll be talking about in the intermission.
I will indeed. And it's all very well to turn left, but the question is when.
Exactly. And that's playing on your mind. And so you eventually nod off to sleep, only to be woken by the splintering of wood, the crash of the ship as it plows into a reef. You're thrown from your bunk, screams, wails. You open the door, it's chaos, it's darkness. All you can hear are people screaming and the sound of water pouring in. You clamber up onto the deck. It's obviously complete darkness. The officers are trying to get command of the crew, but the crew refuse to listen because they assume that they're doomed, because they can't swim. They're somewhere in the Indian Ocean. They don't know where. Death seems imminent. They're trying to find the grog so they can get smashed.
Blatant panicking.
Yes, and this carries on for several hours, and during which time about 100 people die of the 330. But when dawn breaks, you rejoice because what you see around you is not empty ocean, but an archipelago of low-lying, scrubby, sandy islands, which suggests salvation of sorts.
Or suggests the thing that they hit in the night, I suspect.
Yes, well, you hit a reef, and the Batavia is gently sinking. It's certainly doomed, but it hasn't sunk yet. And there's an opportunity, therefore, to evacuate to these islands. What you don't realise is that the nightmare has only just begun.
That's a cracking start.
Thank you. So, Chris, before we get into the whys and wherefores of what they were doing there,
I'm just too excited. I need to get into this episode now. Seriously, Conan. It is an incredible story.
It is a great story. But before we get into that, let us quiz you. Do you have any idea what the topic will be on?
Something to do with ships by any chance?
No, it's not on ships.
No, oh my God. No. Okay, fine. Is it Dutch words?
Yes.
Oh, damn.
No, not Dutch words.
I'm screwed.
It's on the Dutch. Question number 1. Why are carrots the colour they are?
Because they contain keratin?
Reasonable assumption? No, that is not the natural colour, orange. The natural colour is white or purple, but they were bred by the Dutch to be orange as a way of paying tribute to William of Orange, who led the struggle for Dutch independence from the Spaniards.
I'm sorry, this is such a bizarre fact
that
I need to almost Google this right now. That is absolutely
extraordinary.
True. I know,
it sounds nuts.
And everyone eats these basically orange-derived carrots.
But sometimes, if you notice on the carrot, it's got a little purple bit at the top.
Yeah.
That's their natural colour.
Is that right?
Natural colours, yeah.
That is truly bizarre, Conan. I have absolutely learned something today.
Breed a root vegetable as a way of paying tribute to your... I suppose it was their king or prince.
Now, he said you could have done me a nice painting, maybe a sculpture or two. You've given me a what? You've given me a bag of root vegetables that happen to be orange.
Well, he might not have said that because his nickname was William the Silent.
Man, a few words, clearly.
And the town of Orange in New South Wales, that's directly connected to his family.
You must be kidding.
No. So the Dutch royal family is the House of Orange-Nassau. And they descend from one of the generals at the Battle of Waterloo, who was Dutch. There are a number of central New South Wales towns named after generals who served at the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington being the obvious one, Orange, Picton, and Maitland. My middle name. There you are.
Incredible. Incredible, that's your middle name. That's a very bizarre one. But no, incredible fact, Conan. Really, really quite astounding.
And you know why there were no bones? This is a tangent, I'm sorry, everyone. This is not Australian history, but there's the Battle of Waterloo, which is in Belgium. Everyone who died there was buried there, but their bones are no longer there. Any idea why?
Not a clue.
They were harvested by British fertiliser companies, ground up, and then sold to Yorkshire farmers.
They ground up
the
bones of their dead soldiers and dead French and everyone else.
Yeah.
Cheapers, creepers. That's an astounding fact. I am more astounded in your quiz today than I have been this entire series so far, Conan. That's incredible.
Question number 2, clogs. Mm-hmm. Why?
Because it's very wet in Holland. I suspect, the clogs that keep the water out, kind of like gumboots, sort of. You can just wander around.
Yeah,
leave them outside your house.
I would pretty much accept that. Yes, and they also were apparently very good because, as you say, it's quite a waterlogged country. If you're dealing with mud, apparently they're better at negotiating mud than boots. And there's another reason why they were used. If you're mucking around with cows and one of them treads on your foot...
They were the world's first safety boots, basically.
Steel-cut boots. So they're protection. And they were made of willow or poplar.
That's excellent.
In case you were wondering.
It's the what was the most popular type of clogs, Conan?
No. Worst singer yet of the entire series so far.
Thank you very much.
Question 3. What plant led to a massive economic bubble in the Netherlands?
The tulip, by any chance,
Very
yes.
good, yes.
And a massive economic crash, too, I believe.
Yeah, so it went from 1634 to 1637, so 3 years of tulip madness.
Incredible. You could buy whole houses with bunches of bloody tulips.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Well, yes, bulbs. Tulip bulbs. Very good. Question 4. What did Queen Beatrix do in 2013 that perhaps the Queen of England should have done too?
You've got me there.
She abdicated.
Really?
In favour of her son, to give him a fair crack.
Instead, we've got Charles, let's face it, just a couple of weeks ago, going, man, I'm in my mid-70s, and I don't have a lot of time to get some things done.
His best years behind him, possibly.
Indeed.
Who knows? Question 5. What does the new king, William Alexander, do for a hobby?
I'm going to say DJing at kids' parties on the weekends.
I'll give you a clue. It's a hobby close to your own heart.
Sailing?
Do you sail?
No, not really. But it was but you know, I would like to sail.
What's another hobby?
Okay, fine, flying.
Yes.
Flying planes. Okay, yes.
He flies for KLM.
Really?
Yeah.
He actually flies commercial plane. Oh, that is just... This has been a fantastic series of facts, Kane.
Yeah, and I have Dutch friends listening to this who probably take great pleasure in correcting me on some of those things, but I stand by them. What you will definitely correct me on, though, is my pronunciation of the following, which is the Dutch East Indies Company in Dutch, right? So it was called the VOC, which was short for Verenigd Oost-Indische Company. Now, apparently that stands for the United Dutch East India Company. And why I'm mentioning this is because the reason why these people were at the other side of the world, in the middle of nowhere, as far as they were concerned, was the desire to make vast sums of money out of spices. And the VOC was at the heart of that at the time.
And they really did make vast sums of money.
They made staggering
like,
sums.
Literally, I spent some time, as you know, on sailing a replica of the Dolphin.
Yeah.
Absolutely. A few years ago now. And I recall some of the stories we used to read about as part of our, as a tourist ship. You'd open it up and people would come on board. And they would literally say, like, handfuls of spice, cinnamon and sort of things. You could literally purchase properties back in Holland.
Yeah. It transformed the Netherlands into the wealthiest country,
Indeed.
Certainly per capita, in Europe at the time. And it created the sort of golden age of the Netherlands, where it created a demand for their, very fine painters. And that's why you have your Rembrandts and your Vermeers, because there was a huge demand for. And of course, they're doing portraits of merchants and their families and their dogs and whatever.
It's certainly a country that's been punching above its weight for a long time, that's for sure.
Yes. The reason it was called the United Dutch East Indies Company was because there were 6 companies prior to it forming in 1601. They were all trading with the Dutch East Indies, and they felt it makes economic sense to combine. It was the first joint stock company in the world. And before the Dutch came along, the Portuguese controlled the spice trade in present-day Indonesia. But in 1601, the year that they formed, 5 Dutch ships drove out a fleet of 30 Portuguese ships and took control of that area, the Moluccas, Java, this kind of thing.
5 Dutch ships.
5.
Yeah, the old Portuguese must be a little bit crestfallen.
Yes.
I suspect, losing such a one-sided battle.
Would you go as far as to say they were flummoxed?
I think they may have been flummoxed indeed.
Yeah. So by the mid-1600s, the VOC boasted some 150 merchant ships and 50,000 employees. It had a private army of 10,000 soldiers and trading posts from the Persian Gulf to Japan.
And they kicked off the stock market.
Yeah, and this is why they'd be called the first multinational.
Is there anything they didn't do?
Well, no, really. In effect, they were a state outside the state. They had the power to wage war. They could make treaties with Asian rulers. They could punish and execute criminals. They could create new colonies. They could even strike their own coins.
Government in their own right.
Yeah, and they lasted for 200 years from 1601 or so. 1602, I'm sorry, and made 5,000 voyages from the Netherlands to various parts of Asia.
To overuse a term, that is extraordinary.
Yes, but there was a downside for everyone else. In order for them to be rich, they demonstrated a ruthlessness that does not reflect well on the Dutch, I'm afraid.
Yeah, human rights wasn't a strong suit, if I recall, of the Dutch East India Company, was it?
No, they were keen on massacring locals. Mm-hmm. They used slaves from West Africa. They were pretty relaxed about health and safety too, for that matter. I don't think they really cared that much about even their own employees. But the merchants who owned the shares back in the Netherlands made a fortune from it, sometimes as much as 40% dividends. Their attitude is best summed up by this Dutch proverb: Jesus Christ is good, but trade is better. Oh, and by the way, we've talked in the past about Dutch exploration of Australia, and they did a lot of it, as we know, basically half the continent, if not more. That was all done by the VOC, wasn't the Dutch government.
They clearly didn't see the same potential on the Australian mainland as there was, obviously, working with those societies that were established in what is now Indonesia and other places.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And they were just looking for opportunities. Yeah. That's the only reason they mapped it. But also, I guess, for navigation purposes, because what was happening was that Batavia was by no means alone, as in the ship, was by no means alone in smacking into Western Australia. Happened all the time because they couldn't determine longitude and it relied on the dead reckoning of the skipper. So there are wrecks up and down the West Australian coast, and particularly around where the Batavia was wrecked, which is called the Houtman Abrolhos Islands. Houtman being the Dutchman who discovered it 10 years previously. So that's why the Batavia...
And he didn't think to put a lighthouse there.
An oversight. So that's why the Batavia was there. And the people aboard comprised, there were about 150 crew. There were 100 mercenaries as well that were going to replenish the VOC's troops up in Batavia. And there were quite a few passengers as well, including merchants.
I would recommend anyone go to the Maritime Museum in Fremantle and see the size of this thing. Nowhere near as big as you could imagine.
No. And they built a replica of it as well. You can see that in the Netherlands. It's probably bigger than the Doifken. It was a big vessel for the time, but yeah. And this is the thing. I mean, it's very hard for us now to really understand why you would do this to yourself. Why you would go to Batavia.
It'd be frightening. The whole thing would
Every aspect of it would be bad. Because
cash.
It was clearly just cash, but there's no absolute guarantee you're going to make money there, right? But there's a decent chance, and I guess you would be set up for life potentially. But the problem was that the journey, as I said, was up to 8 months. There's a decent chance you could die of dysentery or scurvy, typhus, pleurisy, pneumonia en route, or the ship could be wrecked in a storm or on the West Australian coast or somewhere else. Even in the late 18th century, the death rate could be as high as 45%.
45% attrition just through disease and health issues on board.
Yeah.
That is
And that's just one voyage. Once you're in Batavia, you stood a 1 in 4 chance of dying from malaria within the first year.
Yeah,
and then you've got to make the journey back.
Get rich or die trying, I suppose.
Yeah, quite. In terms of its size, the Batavia was 150 foot long. It was launched in 1628. So the journey it made to Batavia was its maiden voyage. It was laden with silver, and she set sail on the 28th of October that year as the flagship of 8 VOC vessels. Now, let's introduce you to the main characters, Chris, because this should be a movie. Really, this is crazy.
I can't believe it isn't a movie.
Yeah.
I've seen some documentaries.
Yeah.
I cannot believe this isn't a movie.
It's been an opera. I've written a script, so if anyone's listening out there who any film producers, they go, "Oh, this is a great story."
We don't believe in self-promotion, by the way.
No. But just get in touch by Instagram. So first of all, Francisco Pelsart, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce these names properly, right? So he, along with Ariane Jacobs, were the 2 guys in charge. By that I mean, so the VOC had this policy of they would have a senior merchant who would be called the commandeur, which is basically like, think of him as an admiral of the entire fleet. But he wasn't a mariner, he was a merchant. So he just made decisions, but would then instruct his skipper, in this case, Ariane Jacobs. So they obviously had to get on because they were sort of in dual charge of the Batavia. The problem is that these 2 particular men hated one another because they had met before and had a big falling out in India. So not a great start. Another character, 27-year-old Lucretia van der Meylen, who was an aristocratic young woman on her way to Batavia to join her husband.
A bold soul if there ever was one.
I wouldn't do that for... Of course I would do that for you, sweetheart. Goes without saying. 4th character, a man called Webby Hayes, who's one of the 100 or so mercenaries on the lowest deck of the Batavia, called the Orlop deck. This is the worst place to be.
Right down in the darkness and the stench.
And finally, Pelsart's deputy, whose name was Geronimus Cornelius. And he was a bizarre man, and he's very much at the heart of the story. He was a former apothecary, in other words, a pharmacist, who had joined the VOC pretty much at the last minute before the Batavia sailed to avoid being persecuted for his adherence to the heretical values of the painter Terentius, who was very much into hedonism and pleasure. Like, if it gives you pleasure to do it, doesn't matter about morality or the law. Now, Cornelius befriended Jacobs, the skipper, right? And together the 2 men began plotting a mutiny, and they began recruiting accomplices, presumably tempted by the silver in Batavia's hold. Their plans became more feasible when the Batavia was separated from the rest of the fleet during a storm off the Cape of Good Hope. So suddenly the ship is by itself.
Starting to feel ominous.
It's getting ominous. Oh, by the way, the VOC, over the course of its history, experienced 45 mutinies, so it wasn't wildly uncommon.
Obviously, the sort of company you really want to be working for.
Yeah.
On that Google review, they get kind of half a star.
Yes. If you think your working conditions aren't great, then anyway. Then, as I said, on the 4th of June, 1629, the Batavia smashed into the reef in the northern part of the Hutman of Rojas. Now, the Hutman of Rojas are 60 k's off what is now Geraldton. So they wouldn't have been able to see the Australian mainland. The northern part is called the Wallaby Group now. They're spread over an area of about 170 square kilometres. So they decided to evacuate, of course, the sinking ship. It took about a week to sink, by the way. They had one longboat.
They had plenty of time,
They did, yes. Yes, it could certainly have been worse.
We'll do 6 loads today and maybe a few tomorrow. We'll have a little rest.
Yes, quite. So what they did was they started moving people over to... I'm going to rename these islands just to make it a bit easier to understand, okay? So I'm just going to call this island Main Island. They got about 100 people over to Main Island, along with quite a bit of food and water, because it was otherwise waterless. The sailors and the officers moved to a nearby island, which I'll call Pelsart Island, okay? So they're divided that way. A handful of people remained on the ship, including Cornelius. So over the next few days, Pelsart and Jacobs used the longboat to hastily inspect the other islands within the group, and they found neither water nor food. And so they made a controversial decision to look for water on the Australian mainland. And if they didn't find it there, they would get help from Batavia, which was 3,000 kilometres away. So this is probably something they should not have done. Pelsart and Jacobs left in the middle of the night in the longboat. They took about 40 or 50 people on Pelsart Islands, mostly sailors, along with all of the Batavia's officers. And
all of the Batavia's officers. So they left no one in charge.
No one in charge.
That is
on Main Island.
Extraordinarily rubbish decision.
And they didn't tell anyone on Main Island that they were doing it. So, of course, everyone left behind thought they had been abandoned. So Pelsart, etc., couldn't find water on the mainland, so they did head to Batavia.
That's certainly a bold commitment, isn't
yes,
it?
And if you think that Bligh again.
Oh my God, I mean, how many thousands of kilometres did he take that little boat?
Yeah, and they succeeded. It's ironic that Jacobs got that right, that far more difficult navigational feat right, but he couldn't avoid wrecking the Batavia. Anyway, however, I said that all of the officers are gone, but that's not strictly true, because as I said, Cornelius was still on board the sinking
sort of
Batavia,
cowering there, drinking his rum.
Yeah. After Pelsart, etc., had left, finally Cornelius gets to shore, gets to Main Island, and what he finds there are 180 desperate, dispirited people looking for a leader. And if that sounds like...
That's so right. If someone looking for a charismatic megalomaniac, then they found their person.
Yes, and if you're experiencing severe First World War reparations and you need someone to lead you against the Weimar Republic, against a weak and flimsy government, then, yeah, you can see the parallel. So that's Cornelius. Now, when he got there, he discovered that an accomplice in the mutiny that he'd been plotting had revealed the plot to Pelsart. So he knew that if Pelsart succeeded in getting to Batavia and did come back to rescue them, he would be in deep doo-doo and would face a death sentence. Because it goes without saying that they reserve the most gruesome punishments for mutineers. The Dutch were the VOC. They broke you at the wheel, which we've discussed in the very first episode.
Indeed we did.
Yeah.
Indeed we did. A very painful way to go.
Yes, a slow and gruesome way. His only chance, therefore, lay in taking control of the islands and seizing any rescue ship that came along.
Straight from a movie, isn't it? When you think about it, what a great plan.
Yes, well, he probably felt he didn't have any try. I mean, I'm not justifying it. Yeah, he was also almost certainly a psychopath, right? I mean, it's dangerous diagnosing people from, I'm not in a position to do it anyway, but it seems that he did have a certain amount of charisma. He was certainly enjoy sort of controlling and manipulating people. And from his actions that follow, I think we will get a clear sense he was not a man who had a lot of empathy.
I think, the classic kind of charisma-laden madman that we've seen through history before.
Yes,
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. So he began slowly and in a perfectly law-abiding way, as these people tend to do. In fact, he improved the situation. He restored order because people were panicking. He rationed supplies. In recent days, it had rained and some of the Batavia's food had washed ashore, and they were able to gather water from stretching out canvas and stuff. So he was able to sort of get things back on track, get the trains running on time. Before his arrival, the survivors had formed a council, and Cornelius now used his rank to chair the council, and gradually replaced its members with his own men.
These are people that are part of the mutiny plot, I suspect.
Yeah, basically thugs. And then he decided. He said, you know what, guys? I think it's probably best if we have all of the weapons,
just to maintain order.
Yes,
it's all about order.
It's just to. That's right. Otherwise, you guys might panic. So he did that. Took control of the makeshift boats and rafts that the survivors had made as well. And then he went for classic divide and conquer. So he began splitting the population up. He dispatched some of them to 2 nearby islands, but his main concern were the mercenaries. They were well-disciplined soldiers. I mean, some had died in the wreck, so I believe there probably would have been about 20 or so at this point.
20 mercenaries.
20 mercenaries, and he popped them all in boats and had his men take them off to what I'll call Mercenary Island, okay, which is quite some distance away. He had said to them, look, it's quite a big island. We're just going to leave you there for a while. Obviously, we'll come back and rescue you, goes without saying. Well, while you're there, if you can just suss out the food and water situation, that'd be great. So they're marooned there, and he thinks problem solved. Because it was too far for them.
Didn't leave them with the boat.
No.
Just left them
Just
there.
left
Said,
them
we'll
there.
see you guys in a couple of days.
Yeah, absolutely. So
But,
weeks went by.
The mercenaries were clearly brave men, but not too smart.
Possibly. But they probably weren't getting a clear sense of quite where things were heading.
It makes sense.
Because he would have rationalised why he'd split the population to those other 2 islands.
You mentioned the charisma as well.
The charisma,
Indeed.
yeah. And they were following orders. He was a senior VOC man. He was in legitimate command at this point. By the way, these men were under the command of Webby Hayes, who I mentioned before, right? And the island was about 8 kilometres away, so Cornelius felt he was pretty safe for them. It was at this point that he began instigating a drawn-out massacre.
So he's gotten rid of the threats.
Yep.
And now he can carry on as he pleases.
Yes, that's right. He began by ordering his men to slaughter the entire population of one of the nearby islands, right? Just kill them in one go. Get it done.
Did the people on... I wonder if the people on the main island saw this happening. I presume the islands were within visual distance.
Look, I can't actually answer
They would have heard
that.
guns. They would have heard all sorts
He didn't
of
use
stuff.
guns.
Oh.
He didn't need to because they were unarmed.
That's nasty,
So
yes.
he did actually have 2 muskets, or primitive pre-musket firearms, but he was saving them for when the rescue ship arrived. He was keeping his powder dry. So over the next few weeks, the killing continued on the main island itself. The strongest were killed at night, the throats cut, others were taken out on rafts and drowned. The sick and lame were targeted, children too, because there were unfortunately kids. There was a missionary whose entire family were killed. He had 5 kids, I think, while he dined with Cornelius. So Cornelius was being friendly and charming, invited him around for dinner. His men killed his entire family while he was out.
I just don't know how the population on the main island didn't realise, well, maybe we should revolt.
Well, they didn't have the weapons, and they were terrified. And he was also making it clear that you could survive, but to do so, you had to kill other people.
Ah, I
So
see.
they-
So you kill that person, I'll keep you alive.
Yeah, so there was always an element of hope. So that's kind of why it's so diabolical, but often they would just be killed anyway. And of course, Cornelius's men raped any woman they chose. And in fact, Lucretia van der Marlen was forced to become Cornelius's concubine.
What a hellhole.
Yeah. So in mid-July, Cornelius ordered the massacre of those on
And
the...
how long had they been there by mid-July?
That's a good question. This is about 5 or 6 weeks after they'd wrecked. It was then that he ordered the massacre of those on the other nearby island.
I just can imagine. I mean, I don't know how far these islands were. I must go there one day. But if you were on a neighbouring island, cowering, watching or hearing what was going on, probably hearing, I mean, my goodness, it would have been horrific.
It would have been, yeah.
And you're trapped.
You're trapped.
You're absolutely
And,
trapped.
Yeah. Unspeakable, really. But as this massacre was taking place, some of them managed to escape. Some of them could swim, and they swam for Mercenary Island. Because at that point, Hayes and his men weren't aware of what was going on. They were just too far away. And it was these survivors who warned Hayes that Cornelius had been massacring everyone. It was at this point that Hayes becomes kind of the hero. So he uses blocks of coral and flotsam to fortify the island, to create a sort of small fort. And they started also fashioning primitive weapons from anything they could, driftwood or whatever. What's remarkable is that this fort is still standing.
You can see this today.
Yes, so it's only about
400 years later almost.
Yes, and it's only about waist high, and it's not big, and it's possible that it's been reconstructed to some extent. Just Google, and you'll see it's a pretty nice bit of work they've done. But it, in fact, was life-saving, because Cornelius now realizes that he's going to have to kill them all. He's going to have to kill the mercenaries because they could warn any rescue ship that came along. By the way, the reason why they had survived is because Cornelius was wrong about Mercenary Island being bereft of food and water. It actually had both. There were sort of depressions that collected rainwater, and there were also little wallabies.
Thankfully, Cornelius was a complete goose.
Yes.
I think, thankfully. I mean, my goodness, this could have gone all sorts of different ways. Well,
Yeah, but he's
bad ways.
But he still held the upper hand because he had more weapons and he had firearms. So in early August, so 2 months or so after they had wrecked, he made 2 attempts to storm Mercenary Island, and he was repelled on both occasions. On the third attempt, Cornelius himself was captured, and 3 of his lieutenants were killed. Now, it was at this point that the mutineers, they were commanded now by a youngish man called Wouter Lewis. He took command, and on the 17th of September, so quite a bit later, he attacked Mercenary Island again. And this time, he used the mutineers' 2 muskets, which Cornelius had been reserving. And it was with these that he was able to kill 3 of Hayes's men. And frankly, it wasn't looking good for the mercenaries, right? So
I presume that they just had rocks that they were throwing at the...
it could work there. They could have been
Cornelius's men.
I mean, they certainly couldn't match any kind of firearm, so they would have just been sitting ducks, really. But it was at this moment, just as the tide of the battle was turning against the mercenaries, that fighting ceased. Any idea why?
I'm going to put it down to a weather event.
No.
I have no idea.
A ship appeared on the horizon.
Really?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. This is just high drama.
It's high drama, Chris. And on that cliffhanger, it's time for the intermission.
Today we're going to talk about, of course, longitude. Look, as you know, Conan, you need 2 things to find out where you are on the globe.
Yes.
What do you think they are?
Are they by any chance latitude and longitude, Chris?
Indeed they are. Essentially, latitude, how far north or south you are, and of course longitude, how far east or west you are.
A compass too would be handy.
Yeah, I suspect that.
Also a chart.
Yes. Well, I'm not talking about instruments to find that.
Okay.
Quite clearly. So you need 2 points, right? You need 2 points to understand where you are on the planet, and of course, it's really important, well, it's particularly important to know those 2 points, your latitude and your longitude. If you're at sea, you don't have any reference points, so where the heck are you? Latitude, of course, was the easy one. So you can calculate your position just by using a reference point aligned to those north or south poles, or like the North Star, for example, or your angle to the sun at a particular time of year. Okay.
Which you would use a sextant to determine.
That is correct. So longitude. Longitude is a little more complex. The first thing you need in terms of determining longitude is a reference point. And that reference point, of course, isn't a natural reference point, unlike, the axis of the Earth, which is a clear reference point, both north and south. So instead you just make it up. And of course, it's moved around. It's all been very political in the past. And now it has landed at, of course, Greenwich.
Did the French, I think they made Paris 0 degrees of longitude, didn't
Indeed,
they?
St. Petersburg was one once, and others.
Right.
There was a range of others. And in fact, when in the late 1800s, when there was some sort of 26 nations got together and agreed on Greenwich being the prime meridians, but the French disagreed, obviously continued with their Parisian excursion for another kind of 25 or 30 years. So London basically serves as the prime meridian today. And now we get to the tricky business of measuring longitude.
So you need to work out the exact number of degrees, minutes, and seconds, or whatever, from from the prime meridian, in order to determine
the
longitude.
Exactly. So if you think going around the world, it's 360 degrees. In order to determine that, it's essentially just linked to time. And look, that's been known for a very long time, that it's linked to time. Essentially, the Earth rotates from west to east. It takes 24 hours. And so the Earth basically rotates 15 degrees per hour, or 1 degree of longitude every 4 minutes. So if you know what your time is versus time at your reference point, so in this case, Greenwich Mean Time, and you can measure that accurately, you can effectively work out your longitude.
So all you need to do is to take a clock.
Indeed. Clearly, the inability to measure longitude, of course, didn't just lead to the wreck of the Batavia, led to many, many wrecks. And of course, increasingly, European economies were more reliant on merchant shipping. And so this was becoming a real problem. The French government established a science academy in 1666 to really focus on this problem. And of course, in the meantime, ships were continuing to use dead reckoning. It was prone to mistakes, prone to inaccuracies, and often led to disaster. And in fact, there was a famous disaster in 1707. Admiral Sir Cloudesley Chauvel was travelling from Gibraltar towards the English Channel, poor visibility. They incorrectly measured their longitude via dead reckoning. They did it very poorly. And 4 of the 5 ships crashed and sank, killed 2,000 troops, and the murder of the very admiral himself by a local woman after he washed ashore.
Wow.
Oh,
Wow.
and perhaps her relatives were on board. Anyway, one of the biggest shipwrecks in British history, and the British government instituted the Longitude Act of 1714, which I think is fantastic, which included a cash prize for anyone to find a solution to the problem of longitude. It was very difficult to measure time on a ship.
Yeah, so they had clocks, not ones that were reliable at sea.
That's exactly right. They had clocks, pendulum clocks, and everything else that existed at that time certainly had clocks. But the problem is, clocks don't operate very well when they're bumping, up and down. There's changes in temperature, the orientation of the ship, of course, changes. But the point is, it was incredibly difficult to get clocks that remained accurate over the course of the voyage. And it came down to, would you believe, a carpenter in Yorkshire called John Harrison, and we believe his brother James. They took up the challenge to develop a timepiece that would keep time accurately. And he essentially built a series of chronometers named the H1, H named after Humber, where he actually developed these chronometers, through to H4. So over time, they were vastly improved. Very similar to WD-40.
Oh, no.
You recall the WD-40?
I do.
Oh, come on, it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. One of my favourites. So anyway, they used suspended mechanisms, interconnected swinging balances that just wouldn't be affected by the motions of the ship. Right. Really a portable version of some of the larger clocks that he produced. And so they trialled it a couple of times, and they trialled it very successfully. One of the most famous examples of how incredibly well designed these chronometers were, Captain Cook, of course, took one of the chronometers, must have been the H4, I think, on his Antarctic voyage, sailed for 171 days, 40,000 nautical miles. The chronometer lost fewer than 8 seconds over the course of that trip. That's 250 years ago. And of course, Harrison was awarded half of the longitude prize money in 1765. And after, I guess, some of these additional tests, he was awarded the other half about 8 years later.
And I think that's because this has been turned into a book and a TV series, and a lot of it, I think, revolves around class discrimination. So the Admiralty, who were determining who should be awarded the prize, I think they were horrified that a lowly carpenter from Yorkshire should be able to produce such a complex, effective, and for that matter, beautiful instrument, whereas some of the finest minds of their class and in the south of England were unable to.
That's quite incredible. It's making me reflect on our black box story, of course. These sorts of themes come up again and again in our conversations, don't they, Conan? So anyway, there you go. It's a great story.
Yeah, and it would be interesting. I mean, we will never know, but if it hadn't been for him, who would have come up with a reliable maritime clock? And therefore, it might have been quite a while later, in which case Harrison saved God knows how many lives.
Indeed.
And did it really sort of despite all this pushback.
Yeah, that's right.
So he got that in 1765, and it was in 1714 that the...
1714 was the act was actually established.
It took
that's
50 years.
Yeah, quite incredible.
Wow.
Yeah. So he obviously started a few years after the act. Clearly he was getting pretty old by the time he got the reward. I mean, outrageous, really.
Yes, but, you know the poems when it comes to class. Thank you for that, Chris. Excellent, as always.
Thank you, Coach.
So back to the Hutbana Rojas Islands in 1629.
This is where the cliffhanger I can see it now. You do the episode in the last episode.
Yes, that's right.
Cornelius found himself staring at a ship coming across the horizon.
Yeah. And who do you think was aboard that ship?
I'm going to suspect it was Pelsart.
Correct.
He made it.
It's amazing. So it had taken them 33 days to travel that 3,000 kilometres. Yeah, and everyone aboard survived. There were no deaths. Yeah.
That deserves a movie right there.
Yeah. So once in Batavia, Pelsart quickly arranged a rescue ship called the Sardam, but it took 7 weeks to make the return voyage to the Abrojos. My understanding is that the VOC in Batavia, they didn't really care about rescuing the people. I think they were principally concerned about the silver that was...
So without the silver, chances are a rescue wouldn't have been mounted.
It's possible. He wouldn't have been given the Sardam. When the mutineers and the mercenaries saw Pelsart's ship on the horizon sailing towards them, they realised that the first to get there would be the one who would be able to tell their version of events. And if the mutineers got there, they might be able to take control of the ship.
Initiate his grand scheme,
yes,
effectively.
Yeah. Now, remember that Cornelius was being held prisoner, but Luis was in command of the mutineers. So he had a boat. That's how they got to Mercenary Island. And also, luckily, the mercenaries had their own boat as well. So you had two boats.
I presume they got that boat off the initial landing of Cornelius and co. Because they didn't have a boat the whole time, surely.
Yeah, I don't know. Somehow they had a boat. Maybe, as you say, they nicked it off the mutineers. So the fate of the remaining survivors really came down to the outcome of a rowing race. So these two boats frantically rowing.
And the desperation for both groups, because everything is on the line.
Yeah,
everything.
Absolutely. Happily, Hayes and his men got to Pelsart's ship, to the Sardam first. They were able to state what had been going on. Pelsart immediately arrested the men in Lewis's boat.
I presume Pelsart was quite suspicious of Cornelius and co. at this stage as well. So,
well, he certainly, yes, he had been alerted prior. That he knew Cornelius was up to no good, so I don't think it took much persuasion. So then, yes, he arrested the mutineers on Mercenary Island who were attacking the mercenaries, and then they sailed to Main Island, and the mutineers there quickly surrendered. So that's good. Now, Pelsart built a jail and did what the Dutch did back then.
Built a jail on the island.
Built a simple jail to house the mutineers. It was Dutch law at the time that if you wanted people to confess to a crime, you tortured them until they confessed. So that's what they did. But
you wouldn't need to torture me. I'd confess straight away. Yeah, yep. Did you? Yes, I did everything. Yes,
yeah, that's right. So Cornelius and his 6 closest accomplices were hanged on makeshift gibbets, but each of them had a hand chopped off first, except Cornelius, who had both hands chopped off. So that was
nasty.
Yeah, and there were worse ways, as we said, being broken on the wheel. So in fact, quite a few other mutineers were taken back to Batavia itself, and they were executed there. And probably that would have been being broken on the wheel,
but not to take Cornelius.
Yeah,
I wonder why they didn't.
I imagine probably safety. Just from Pelsart's point of view, you just want to get the ringleader dispatched.
Having this devil whispering to people on your boat on the way back. I get it. Yeah. No, I very much get it.
Pelsart then spent 6 weeks salvaging most of the silver successfully from the wreck of the Batavia. Then they took, as I said, this 16 remaining mutineers back to Batavia and 70 survivors. So the only mutineers to escape execution were Lewis and a cabin boy called Pelgrim.
Lewis?
Yeah, he wasn't executed.
Yeah?
But he was punished. Would you like to have a stab at how he was punished? He wasn't taken to Batavia. He wasn't executed on the Abrojos.
I think he might have been left to his own devices on the Australian mainland, if I recall.
Very good, yes. So both of them were left there. And it is conceivable that they were Australia's first European settlers.
Wow.
If you wanted,
there could even be,
in the loosest sense of the term, settlers.
That's right. I mean, who knows? They may have potentially prospered there.
They might have. They weren't the only Dutch people to end up on the mainland. People who were shipwrecked. They might have been taken in by local First Nations people. They might not have been. Of course.
Interesting that there were the two. I mean, the cabin boy, I'm surprised the cabin boy was in on it, but I guess he just did whatever they said, to be fair. But, I'm kind of surprised that was their fate.
It was an odd choice.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
Now, in terms of what happened to all of these people, as I said, Cornelius had been executed. Hayes got to Batavia and was promoted. Lucretia van der Meulen, she arrived in Batavia only to find that her husband had died. After all of that.
After the nightmarish, 10 months she's had.
Yeah.
To turn up and go, oh, and by the way, your husband's dead.
But what she did do is marry another army officer, and she returned to Amsterdam, where she lived to 81.
Quite incredible.
Yes.
Quite incredible. It's a shame these people didn't... I wonder if they wrote their memoirs on their time on the Batavia. I mean,
well, there was a book written about it, and that was published a few years later, and therefore the incident became well known amongst certainly the Dutch. Now, what happened to Jacobs? We're not entirely sure. We believe he died in jail, and he was jailed for negligence around the wreck of the Batavia, even though, as we've discussed, he did a fantastic job getting to actual Batavia. Pelsart, meanwhile, died of disease in September 1630. His reputation tarnished by what had happened, presumably around his decision to leave. But also, ultimately, the buck stopped with him. So even though...
He was in charge regardless of where he was.
Yeah, and there'd been a mutiny fermenting and blah, blah, blah. He would have died in Batavia. The wreck of the ship was found in 1963, and much of it was salvaged. And as you said, it's on display at the West Australian Maritime Museum. It's worth a look. As I said, the remnants of Hayes Fort...
Which I'll be looking up straight after we finish talking.
Yeah. Yes, when you think about it, it's the first building in Australia to be made by Europeans. You can still see it on the island, which is called West Wallaby. As many as 80 skeletons are believed to lie on the main island. The actual name of the island is Beacon Island, or Batavia's Graveyard. So of the 200 people who survived the wreck, an estimated 125 men, women and children were murdered by Cornelius and his men. Yes, so there you have it, Chris. A dreadful tale. It's it's like Lord of the Flies, but real and with adults.
Yeah, you know what? I was literally going to use that very language at the beginning of this. It is exactly it's like a horrific version of Lord of the Flies.
Yeah.
I think. There have been some wonderful documentaries have been on SBS and others about the wreck, but I still don't think it's a well-known part of Australian history, regardless. But horrific.
Yeah.
Really, really horrific, for sure.
And it's an illustration, I think, too, of what can happen when the VOC was voracious. It was this sort of mad beast of a thing that led to so much suffering over the 200 years. It was just devoured, and it had no purpose except to make money. It was the template also for the British East Indies Company,
which wasn't
didn't
much
behave
better,
very
to be
well.
quite frank. Yeah,
Either.
Very much behaved in not a dissimilar vein.
No, so it's very much what happens when profit drives everything to the exclusion of pretty much anything else.
Look, thank you. There's some wonderful research that's gone into today's episode. And I've certainly learned new things as well, and I thought I was familiar with the Batavia story.
And if you want more info on this, you can read a book called Batavia's Graveyard by Mike Dash.
I guess that leads us to, what do we have on next?
Chris, next time, David Unipon, the Aboriginal inventor and preacher and writer.
Brilliant. And I believe he's on our currency.
He's on the $50 note.
Given we spend a lot of time fairly cashless these days, I don't think many people have seen a $50 note for a while.
Yes, he's an impressive man and well worth discussing, particularly as I don't think a lot of people know much about him. So, Chris, yes, until then, it's been great, casting this particular pod. Until next time. See you later.
Brilliant. See you next time.